The morning sun barely touched the old courthouse windows when Officer James Mitchell walked through the heavy wooden doors. He wore his Royal Guard uniform with pride, the gold buttons shining against the dark blue fabric. James had served the royal family for 15 years, protecting them with his life. Today was different. Today, he was here as a witness in a simple traffic case. Before we continue with this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss these amazing real-life stories that will touch your heart and open your eyes. James sat quietly in the waiting area, his back straight and his hands resting on his knees. Other people in the courthouse stared at his uniform. Some whispered to each other, wondering why a royal guard was there. James didn't mind the attention. He was used to people looking at him. His job was to be seen, to be a symbol of protection and honor. The courtroom clerk called his name. James stood up and walked into the courtroom. The room was old, but beautiful, with high ceilings and dark wood everywhere. Judge Harrison sat at the bench, looking down at his papers. Judge Harrison was known in the city as a tough man. He had been a judge for 20 years and thought he knew everything about the law. He believed his position made him more important than anyone else in his courtroom. When James walked to the witness stand, Judge Harrison looked up. His eyes narrowed when he saw the uniform. A small, mean smile appeared on his face. James noticed it but said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best response to rudeness. The lawyer asked James to state his name and occupation. James spoke clearly, his voice steady and respectful. He explained that he witnessed a car accident while he was off duty, driving home from the palace. The accident was simple. One car ran a red light and hit another car. Nobody was badly hurt, but the insurance companies needed a witness statement. Judge Harrison interrupted before James could finish. His voice was loud and filled with mockery. He asked James if protecting the royal family made him think he was special. The courtroom went silent. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. James remained calm, his face showing no emotion. He had faced far more dangerous situations than an angry judge. The judge continued his insults. He said that royal guards were just fancy decorations, nothing more than toy soldiers who stood around looking pretty. He laughed at his own jokes, expecting others in the courtroom to join him. A few people smiled nervously, but most looked uncomfortable. They could see that Judge Harrison was being unprofessional and cruel. James still said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on the judge with quiet dignity. Judge Harrison seemed to enjoy his own performance. He leaned back in his chair, playing with his gavel like it was a toy. He told James that in his courtroom, the only authority that mattered was his own. Royal guards meant nothing here. The judge said these words with such confidence, as if he truly believed he was untouchable. James finally spoke, his voice still calm and respectful. He told the judge that he was only there to tell the truth about what he saw. He had no interest in challenging anyone's authority. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He stood up from his bench and pointed his finger at James. He said that people like James, who wore fancy uniforms, always thought they were better than regular citizens. The judge's face was red now, and his voice got louder with each word. He accused James of wasting the court's time with his presence. He said the court didn't need testimony from someone who probably couldn't even write a proper report. The lawyer representing the case tried to speak up. She told the judge that Officer Mitchell was a respected member of the Royal Guard, and his testimony was important for the case. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down hard on the desk. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. He told the lawyer to be quiet or he would hold her in contempt of court. The young lawyer sat down quickly, her hands shaking. James watched all of this happen. Inside, he felt anger rising, but he had been trained to control his emotions. Years of standing guard in all kinds of weather, facing protesters and threats, had taught him patience. He knew that reacting to the judge's insults would only make things worse. So he stood there, straight and tall, waiting for this moment to pass. What Judge Harrison didn't know was that James wasn't just any royal guard. He held a special position within the royal security team. He was responsible for investigating threats against the royal family. This meant he had access to confidential information and worked closely with police and government officials. He had security clearance that most people never even knew existed. The judge finally told James he could step down from the witness stand. But before James could move, Judge Harrison made one more comment. He said that maybe James should go back to the palace and stand still like a statue, since that was all he was good for. Some people in the courtroom gasped at the rudeness. James simply nodded his head slightly and began to walk toward the door. As James walked toward the exit, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. 3 men in dark suits entered quickly. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the room. Behind them came a woman carrying a briefcase, her expression serious and professional. James recognized one of the men immediately. It was Director Phillips, the head of the Royal Security Service. James stopped walking and stood to the side, his training telling him that something important was about to happen. Director. Phillips walked straight to the front of the courtroom. He didn't look at James or anyone else. His focus was entirely on Judge Harrison. The judge looked confused at first, then annoyed. He demanded to know why these people were interrupting his courtroom. He raised his gavel, ready to slam it down again and demand order. But Director Phillips held up his hand, showing an official badge and identification. The director's voice was cold and formal when he spoke. He announced that he was from the Royal Security Service and that Judge Harrison was under investigation. The judge's face went from red to pale white in seconds. He stammered, asking what this was about. He tried to sound angry and authoritative, but his voice cracked with nervousness. The confidence he had shown just moments ago disappeared completely. The woman with the briefcase stepped forward. She opened it and pulled out several documents. She explained that Judge Harrison had been under investigation for 3 months. The charges were serious, accepting bribes from wealthy defendants, fixing court cases in exchange for money, and abusing his power to threaten lawyers and witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed suspicious deposits. Recorded phone calls proved he had made deals with criminals. Several witnesses had come forward with their own stories of corruption. Judge Harrison tried to defend himself. He said this was all a mistake, a misunderstanding. He claimed he had done nothing wrong, and that his record as a judge was spotless. But the woman continued reading from her documents. She listed specific cases where the judge had accepted money. She named amounts and dates. Each piece of evidence she presented made the judge look more guilty and desperate. The courtroom was completely silent except for her voice. Everyone watched in shock as one of the most powerful men in the local court system was exposed as a criminal. James remained standing by the wall, his expression unchanged. He had seen corruption before. It always ended the same way. People who believed they were above the law eventually learned they were wrong. Director Phillips then said something that made everyone in the room understand the full picture. He explained that Officer James Mitchell had been part of the investigation team. James had been asked to appear in court today because the Royal Security Service knew Judge Harrison would be presiding. They wanted to see how the judge treated a member of the Royal Guard. Knowing that the judge had a history of bullying people he thought were beneath him, the revelation sent whispers through the courtroom. People turned to look at James with new understanding. He hadn't been just a witness to a traffic accident. He had been part of a carefully planned operation to catch a corrupt judge. James's calm behavior and patience in the face of the judge's insults now made perfect sense. He had been doing his job, gathering evidence through observation. Judge Harrison's legs seemed to stop working. He sat down heavily in his chair, his face in his hands. All the power and authority he had displayed earlier was gone. He looked like a broken man who had just realized his entire life was about to fall apart. The gavel that he had used to intimidate others lay on the desk, now meaningless. One of the men in suits approached the bench. He informed Judge Harrison that he was being placed under arrest. He read the judge's rights in a clear, official voice that everyone in the courtroom could hear. The judge was told he had the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, and that anything he said could be used against him in court. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same rights the judge had heard thousands of times in his own courtroom were now being read to him. Judge Harrison stood up slowly when told to do so. The bailiff, who had worked for the judge for years, had to help him down from the bench. The judge's hands were shaking as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. He looked around the courtroom one last time, perhaps hoping someone would help him. But everyone just stared back, some with satisfaction, others with pity. As the officers prepared to lead Judge Harrison out of the courtroom, looked directly at James. Their eyes met for a long moment. James saw recognition in the judge's face, and perhaps a bit of respect that came too late. The judge understood now that he had mocked and insulted someone who was far more important and honorable than he had assumed. His prejudice and arrogance had blinded him to the truth. James watched as they walked Judge Harrison toward the door. He felt no satisfaction or joy in seeing the man arrested. Instead, he felt sad that someone in such an important position had chosen corruption over justice. The legal system was supposed to protect people and uphold fairness. When judges broke that trust, everyone suffered. James had dedicated his life to protecting others. Seeing someone abuse their power always disappointed him deeply. After Judge Harrison was taken away, Director Phillips approached James. He thanked him quietly for his professional behavior during the confrontation. James simply nodded. He didn't need praise for doing his duty. The director explained to the remaining people in the courtroom that the case they had been hearing would be transferred to another judge. All of Judge Harrison's recent cases would be reviewed to ensure that justice had been properly served. The lawyer who had tried to defend James earlier came up to him. She apologized for not standing up to the judge more forcefully. James told her there was no need to apologize. She had done what she could in a difficult situation. He understood that lawyers had to be careful not to anger judges, even when those judges were wrong. The system wasn't perfect, but it was important to work within it whenever possible. As people began to leave the courtroom, many stopped to speak with James. Some thanked him for exposing the corrupt judge. Others simply wanted to shake his hand. James was polite to everyone, but he didn't feel like a hero. He had simply been doing his job. The real heroes were the people who had come forward to report the judge's corruption, knowing they might face retaliation. They had shown true courage. News of Judge Harrison's arrest spread quickly through the courthouse and then throughout the city. By that afternoon, it was the top story on every local news channel. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, asking anyone who had been there to describe what happened. Some of the witnesses talked to the cameras, sharing their shock and surprise. The story of how a judge had mocked a royal guard, not knowing he was being investigated, became a powerful reminder that no one was above the law. James returned to the palace that evening, his duty for the day complete. He changed out of his uniform and into comfortable clothes. His wife asked him how his day had been. James smiled and said it had been interesting. He told her about the judge and the arrest, and she listened with wide eyes. She had been married to James for 12 years and still found his work fascinating. That night, James thought about what had happened. He wondered if Judge Harrison had always been corrupt, or if power had slowly changed him over the years. It was a question without an easy answer. James knew that power could change people, making them believe they deserved special treatment. It took strength and character to remain humble and fair when given authority over others. Judge Harrison had failed that test. In the weeks that followed, more details about Judge Harrison's crimes came to light. Investigators discovered that he had been accepting bribes for almost 5 years. He had helped drug dealers avoid serious punishment. He had sided with wealthy defendants against poor victims who couldn't afford good lawyers. He had threatened court staff members who questioned his decisions. The list of his crimes grew longer each day. Many of Judge Harrison's old cases were reopened and reviewed by honest judges. Some people who had been unfairly sentenced were released from prison or had their fines reduced. Victims who had lost cases because of the judge's corruption were given new trials. The legal system worked hard to fix the damage one corrupt man had caused. It was a massive effort that took months to complete. James was called to testify at Judge Harrison's trial. He sat in the witness stand and calmly described what had happened that day in the courtroom. He repeated the insults the judge had said, though it gave him no pleasure to do so. The prosecutor asked James why he had remained so calm during the verbal attack. James explained that his training had taught him to control his emotions, and that reacting with anger would have only made the situation worse. The defense attorney tried to suggest that James had set a trap for Judge Harrison, that the whole situation had been unfair. But James calmly explained that he had simply been doing his job. If Judge Harrison had treated him with respect and professionalism, nothing bad would have happened. The judge's own behavior, his choice to mock and insult someone based on prejudice, had revealed his character. James had only been there to witness it. Judge Harrison was found guilty on multiple charges of corruption, bribery, and abuse of power. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison in order to pay back all the money he had illegally taken. His career was over, his reputation destroyed. The man who had once wielded so much power in the courtroom now had none. He would spend years behind bars, perhaps thinking about the choices he had made and the people he had hurt. For James, life returned to normal. He continued his work with the Royal Guard, standing watch over the royal family and investigating potential threats. The incident with Judge Harrison became a story he sometimes told, usually when training new guards. He used it as an example of why they must always remain professional, even when facing insults or disrespect. Their uniform represented something larger than themselves, and they had a duty to honor it through their behavior. The courthouse, where everything had happened, installed a new judge, a woman known for her fairness and integrity. She worked hard to restore trust in the legal system. People slowly began to believe again that justice was possible, that corrupt officials could be caught and punished. The story of Judge Harrison's downfall served as a warning to anyone who might consider abusing their power. No position was high enough to escape accountability.